Hey, welcome back. We're moving on to communication. This is Dr. Terry Loftus, and this is a continuation of the robotics program, and communication is the next section of this course. And so, obviously, I think everybody recognizes that communication is important. There's no doubt about that. You have to communicate in everything that you do. But I'm going to talk to you specifically about what happens in a robotics committee and who you need to be communicating with and who you need to be getting communication from. It's really important to have that two-way sense of communication. So we're going to talk about different stakeholder groups and go into different ways of communicating with each of those groups. So who are the stakeholder groups? I mean, that's probably something you haven't really thought about. And I think most people would say, well, a robotics committee, everybody who's on robotics is probably a stakeholder group, yeah, no doubt. Medical staff. You may be thinking, well, just the ones who work on the robot. We really don't need to communicate with anybody else. As it turns out, you have physicians, surgeons who are currently have privileges in robotic-assisted surgery, but there may be surgeons out there who don't, but are interested in getting privileges and are interested in learning how to use the robot. There may be surgeons out there who will never be interested. You need to keep them in your communication loop, because if they're never interested and are out there just constantly slamming your program, you want to be able to counter detail those remarks that they may be using to work against your program. So most places usually don't have to work very hard with this type of an issue, but if you have one like that, you want to know who they are as well. And I think in general, you want to just be able to communicate to the rest of your medical staff and let them know what you're doing. The robot's a big mystery to a lot of physicians. They don't understand it. They don't know how it works. They don't know who uses it. And that's probably the important reason why you want to communicate, is because you want to be able to mention all of that to your hospitalists and to your other specialists who just think of the robot as something that's another piece of technology. So important to communicate to them. C-suite. I can't tell you how many times I see robotics committees that don't communicate with their C-suite. Imagine this. The C-suite just invested $2 million, who knows, maybe more, in a robot and all of the service contracts and instruments and accessories. And what's happening? They don't get a word. They don't get any feedback at all on what the program's doing. Not a good way to start the conversation with your C-suite. You want to get them engaged from day one. And you want to be able to have a way of having regular communication with them. Nursing and ancillary staff, you have to be able to communicate with that group. They're important for the success of your program, and particularly the perioperative area as well. Community, one that a lot of people don't think about very often, but they are one of your stakeholder groups, and you have to find a way to get messages out to them, and also hear back from your community as to how your program is being perceived. So let's look at the robotics committee. You may think, well, they're already involved. They're at the committee. Why do we have to have a communication plan for them? But as it turns out, there really is. There's an embedded communication plan within every committee, or there should be. And the two probably biggest things are the agenda and the minutes. And a lot of times people go, oh, why do we have to have an agenda? I don't know. It's better if we just sit around and just kind of free-form thinking and stuff. And that's usually not a very good way to get things done in an organization, and particularly in committee work. You have to have an agenda. An agenda is a forward-looking document. It's describing what you'll be addressing in the future or at the committee that night. And you want people focused on that. You want them thinking about the things that you're going to be looking at. One, because they'll generate better ideas when they know in advance what you're going to be talking about. And two, you want them to start thinking about other things that should be on the agenda that currently isn't on the agenda. And that's important for engagement. Remember, we talked about those things you can do to engage people? That agenda has to have a place on it for future ideas, and we'll talk about that when I show you an example of what an agenda can look like. Minutes are also important. Do not discount the minutes, the importance of the minutes. They're backward-looking documents. They describe what was discussed and found important enough to put in writing. It's important for the sustainability of your program, because not everybody is going to be the same people on the committee year over year. And so you want to have a way of looking back on this. And I had this experience. I took over a co-lead for a surgery clinical consensus group, and I really didn't have a good understanding of all the things that the group was looking at. So I went back. I pulled up all of their minutes from previous meetings over the previous 2 years, and sure enough was able to start to see kind of the things that they were accomplishing, the things that were kind of getting hung up, and the things that they wanted to look at but hadn't had time to get to. So it really helped me when I very first started because I could organize around that and show what the group had accomplished, show what the group was currently working on, and what the group would want to work on. And it was interesting when they saw that big list of things out there, they began to realize, wow, we're really doing a lot of stuff. And it was very important for me as a leader to be able to come in and be able to provide direction for the group and leadership for them, because that's the type of thing that they need. And so for future leaders and future members of your committee, you want them to be able to go back and figure out why did they do what they did? Because a lot of times it's not really clear. And the other thing to remember about minutes is you don't want to make the two biggest mistakes is you can have minutes that are so short that nobody can make heads or tails out of what was discussed, and ones that are long and extremely detailed. And the problem with the long detailed one is nobody ever reads it. In fact, they don't read either of them. But I can guarantee you, every time you read the minutes, you'll see that they were approved, read and approved by all members. It doesn't happen. You want a document that people will be able to look at and read very quickly, relatively quickly, and say, okay, that describes what we talked about. It discusses the salient points, and particularly discusses things like why decisions were being made, and also what future actions needed to be taken and who was going to take them and when. It's important to get that documented because it's amazing how many times people just forget things over time. And if you don't have it written down somewhere, it may as well have not happened. And you don't want your committee to kind of devolve into one of those kind of committees where nobody really gets anything done. They just show up. And if you're fortunate enough to have a meal served or some refreshment served at the time, you sit there and it's almost like a break from the rest of your work. I never really liked that. Got tired of those kind of committees, and I just said, from here on out, I'm not having those kind. I'm going to have committees that are meaningful. So here's an example of an agenda and some things that I put in here. And I put these in, one, because a lot of agendas have these in there, obviously, but there's a reason why they're there. And they promote engagement. Remember we talked about that, finding, how do you create an environment where you're not disengaging people? So right from the beginning, the purpose, and I put a purpose up here of the committee. The purpose of this committee is to improve the quality, utilization, cost, and experience related to robotic-assisted surgery. Why is it important? How many times have you been in a meeting, somebody walks in late, they're upset about something, and they start going on, and they completely derail the meeting, and next thing you know, 30, 40 minutes of an hour-long meeting is spent talking about somebody else's agenda, and it had nothing to do with the purpose of that committee. And you just wasted everybody's time, and we're all sitting there, and one person's upset, but now they feel better because they were able to unload on a group of people, and you're thinking, we're not your counselor here. This is, don't bring this into our meeting. And you have to be able to stop people in their tracks and say, how does this relate to the purpose of this committee? It's right there in our agenda. We're not here to talk about, what the food is like down in the cafeteria. That's some other committee. We're not part of that one, and we don't make comments on that. Some other things that may not seem obvious, date, time, location. You want people to be engaged by having that be consistent. And how this works is if you keep changing, if you say, hey, it's going to be the first Monday at 7 a.m. at Building A, Room 101, guess what? You do that every single time, that's going to promote engagement. If you keep changing it, it's a different day of the week, it's a different time. Sometimes it's for 30 minutes, sometimes it's for an hour and a half, sometimes it's over in Building A, sometimes it's Building B. If you keep doing that, it creates disengagement. People are less likely to show up at your meeting over time. In this particular one, I put in the meeting type just to let people know, hey, this is system oversight, so we're looking at system work, not necessarily facility work. Sometimes you do that, but in this particular one, we'd have to really emphasize that this is about the system. A call-in number and call-in code. Look, not everybody's going to be able to make it to your meeting. We were spread out. The organization I worked at was spread out over 7 states. It's impossible to have meetings and think that people are going to show up to meetings and fit in person. So we had call-in numbers. We had the equivalent of WebEx and things like that, where you can use internet-based tools to help you get engagement with your members. Try to have the same call-in number. Try to have the same type of software that you're using if you're going to use like a WebEx or some other software like that. If it's just something as simple as having a phone that has the audio to be able to let people call in and listen and comment so that everyone in the room can hear them, That's okay too. There's nothing wrong. But try to use the same, remember, if you use the same room, there's a good chance you'll be using the same call-in number and the same phone. Try to keep that consistent. People will, it's amazing how many times physicians, when they see that's being a consistent number, they'll just add that to their contacts. And that way they can just automatically call it. Or if they're driving, they can just do the Siri, if they have an iPhone, and just say, Siri, call the Robotics Oversight Committee tonight. And it calls in for them. And that's the kind of thing that you want to be able to do, because you want people to be able to easily access your meetings. I put in things like called by, meaning who called the meeting order. Who's the timekeeper? Have a timekeeper at your meetings if you can, because it allows the leader to really kind of let things get going in good directions, but also have someone to watch the time and make sure that they're sticking with the agenda. Have a note taker. I don't know, it always drove me crazy. We'd show up at meetings and someone would say, who's going to take the notes, the meeting minutes today? And you're like, really? We got to go through this? We're spending the first 5 minutes waiting for someone to put their hand up and be the minute taker. Have that figured out ahead of time. And as you'll see, when we get to infrastructure, having an admin assistant who's part of that meeting is going to be really key if you can do that. Try to do that. I've had times where I was the person who was both leading the meeting and taking the minutes at the same time, and that's no fun. You want to be able to lead a committee and have somebody else taking those minutes if you can. Keep attendance. It's amazing how many times we would have committees and we'd go back and look at attendance over the past year and find people who were just not showing up. And to me, they're occupying a seat on a committee. If you're occupying a seat on the committee, that means somebody else who might want that seat is not able to sit in those meetings. So if you're not going to be there, I just tell people, look, after 1 year, what we would do is we would typically assess the meeting attendance, and if people were showing up, we'd keep them on the list. And if they weren't showing up, I'd just send them an email and say, hey, thank you very much. You have a suggestion for someone who might take your place, because you got to show up to these meetings. Keep track of the guests. You want to know when guests are there. And just as a courtesy to guests, again, engagement versus disengagement, do something engaging. If you invite a guest, tell them exactly what time they need to be there. And when they get there at that time, bring them, let them discuss what they need to discuss, and then just let them leave the meeting. If you can, put them at the top of your agenda. So if they show up at the rest of the time, at the same time as everybody else, they're the first thing to discuss, and you get them out of the room and lets the meeting go on as it usually does. You don't want guests sitting around. I've had meetings where I sat in and sat there for an hour and a half waiting to present, because the chair decided I'll squeeze you in when I can, and I just said, yeah, well, that's great, because this is going to be the last. You better get it. You better get your questions in, because this is the last time I'm coming to this meeting. I'm not going to sit around for an hour and a half and listen to other people talk about things that really aren't relevant to what I was doing. And so I think it's important to be courteous to your guests and give them that time and that allotted time, and make sure they stick to it. I've also had guests who come in and want to, I had invited a guy one time for 5 minutes, and he was convinced that he should have had 30 minutes. He goes, I've got 30 minutes of material. I said, no, you got 5 minutes. I didn't bring 5 minutes, and figure out a way to condense it. I can't give you 30 minutes. We got other things we have to talk about. So I think that's important to make sure that guests know exactly how much time they have, so they can prepare for your meeting to get it across to you as fast as they can in a way that everybody will appreciate. If there's things people need to prepare for your meeting, tell them. Put it in the agenda. Look at the meeting minutes. And I'm a big believer in having, say, like a SharePoint or some web-based place to drop your meeting minutes where members can have access 24/7. It's really hard sometimes for people to be able to always be in touch with it. It's nice to have one place where they can go. They may not necessarily, you may have sent it to them, email, meeting minutes, or the meeting minutes into their email where they could read it. Well, if they deleted it, now they don't have it, and they're like, oh no, I should have read those, and now I have a place I can go to. So if you can do that, I think that's another thing that can engage them. If you have certain things that you'd like them to do, like bring ideas for Robotics Committee performance improvement goals, tell them. Put it right there. Action items, responsible, and due date. Really important. If you have action items, things that people are going to vote on, people are going to approve or disapprove, remember who's going to be responsible, who's going to be doing the voting. If you have a presenter, who's going to be presenting, and the due date. When do you have to get that done? So previous meeting minutes are always going to be approved. So there's the due date, and it's the membership who's required to do that. Here's some other things. The agenda items. Remember, like I said, have the presenter, have the time allotted, have a brief description of what they're going to be doing. If they have information that's distributed, Make sure that's available to your membership ahead of time. If you're looking at new action items, have that listed down. You want people to look at it and realize, okay, in the future we're going to have to be voting on this, in particular in terms of the, say the annual goals or team metrics, team recommendations. And I think it's important that they know that stuff. Also, at the end of it, include when's the next meeting? Where is it scheduled? Same location, That way they know in advance, okay, it's nothing different. I can just rest easy. I just have to show up, say, the first Monday of the month, and it's at this time and this location, and that's not going to change. Consistency creates engagement. Inconsistency creates disengagement. Be consistent. Have the exact, this agenda, all of the titles and the sections have to be pretty much the same, but what has to change is the content. Why? Because by keeping that consistency of the sections, you now get to change up your content, and that's the interesting part. People know where to look for it, and so they're going to be looking for those things that I'm going to be interested in going to that meeting for, and that creates engagement. And so it's important to have some structure to this, but also change it up over time. So the meeting minutes, and I've got an example here in the meeting minutes. In fact, actually, it's probably a good time to plug. I also, I've created a startup kit, and I think I've mentioned this before, but it's a robotics program startup kit. It has 10 documents. This is an example of one of the documents, meeting minutes. And I have 10 documents in there. It's things that you need pretty much that first day when you're starting up your program, or at least things that I found useful. And if you want a copy of it, if you want the startup kit and those 10 documents, just contact me through my email. Say, hey, Terry, send me a robotics program startup kit. I'll send it to you. It's for free. You'll get it as a zip drive. You just open it up and you can use the documents. You can modify them, adjust them. Feel free. Down there it says copyright Loftus Health. Don't worry about it. You can take that off and use the documents as far as I'm concerned. The important thing is I want you to have material that you feel like you can go ahead and start a committee up overnight. That's really the way this should work. And I want you to feel that you're not at a disadvantage because you don't have these things. So same thing, you see the meeting information we go through. I pretty much use the agenda to help document the meeting minutes, and then just go into what was discussed and any action, in this case, minutes approved here. And then I go into sort of, this is just an example of meeting minutes. The other thing I have in there is that call for conflicts of interest. I think it's important in this day and age that if somebody has a conflict of interest, they should note that. I'm a big, like I said, I went from being an agnostic with robotics to being a believer, and to the point now that I do occasional work for Intuitive Surgical. I always make it a point to say to people, look, it's obviously that's a disclosure and it's a potential conflict of interest, but you should know that. And I just think it's the best way to do it. And I think that members of your committee should be doing that too, because if they're bringing in other ideas, other types of robots and things like that, you want to know, do they have some sort of a position or relationship with those vendors? And so get that one off the table first. Don't wait until you're deep into a discussion to go, okay, wait, we forgot to ask, does anybody have any conflicts of interest? Don't do that. Get it out of the, just say, this is, you saw the agenda, you know what we're going to be discussing. Does anybody have any conflicts of interest related to this discussion tonight? It's important to clear the air on that one. Some other things, you can see, it's kind of like, these are all just examples of discussion, but it's really kind of keeping it down to a minimum amount of information, that just what you need to know. And then what's the action that's being taken as a result of that discussion? What people really, really need to know. They're more likely to read minutes that are this. And here we are talking about 6 agenda items, and all of a sudden you look at it and you realize, holy cow, this is a nice, convenient, short, but succinct way of describing what happened at our meeting. And that's the way it should be. It'll get read, and therefore when they approve it, they really are approving the meeting minutes, and they're not making any material changes. So medical staff. I would say, by far and away, medical staff services is probably one of the most underutilized services in the company. And everything I know about coordinating, communicating, having meetings, I learned from medical staff services. These are people who have dedicated their careers, in many ways, to supporting medical staff. And my observation is, as a general rule, they're pretty good at it. I always hear things like, physicians are like, trying to get a group of doctors together is like herding cats. Yeah, well, it just feels like herding cats when you don't know what you're doing. Medical staff services doesn't describe it that way. Only other people do. Medical staff services have really kind of excelled at that. So I would say when you're coordinating this type of meeting, you may want to work with them, at least learn from them what they've learned, because they're very, very good at it. I was at a meeting one time, and it was not a robotics committee meeting. It was a different type of meeting. We were trying to get a group of physicians together, and I showed up. I handed it off to somebody else. I thought they knew how to coordinate physician meetings, and as it turned out, they really didn't. And I show up at the meeting, and there's a bunch of people from the hospital administration sitting there, and there's no doctors in the room. I'm the only doctor in the room. And I said, "Did you send out the notice?" And they said, Yeah, we sent out the notice. I said, "How many RSVPs did you get?" None. And I said, "Did you call their office and ask them if they were going to come?" No. Did you notify their office that there's this meeting? No. Did you make a call to them? Did you text them? Did you do it? No. That's why nobody showed up. Medical staff services has figured out how physicians like to be communicated with. And sometimes it's a certain person in their office. Sometimes it's a personal invitation. Literally, I remember one person from medical staff services, I said, "How do you get a hold of Dr. So-and-so?" She says, "Well, he always comes down for coffee at 10 o'clock down to the physician's lounge. If I need to get a hold of him, I just go over there at 10 o'clock and grab him and say, 'Hey, this is what you need to do, and this is the meeting.'" And he's always very cordial about it, very nice, and he writes it down in his little pad, and he puts it in his pocket, and he shows up at the meetings, and that's how we do it. And I said, "Do you ever send him an email?" And she's like, "Oh, God, no. He doesn't even use email." And I said, "But he has an email, right?" She's like, "Oh, yeah." She goes, "Yeah, somebody in his office opens it up, but, he doesn't use it. So it's kind of pointless to send him an email." In fact, actually, a lot of them, if they're getting stuff from our hospital, it just went into their spam box. So, you have to be careful about how you organize these things. You really have to understand medical staff. And physicians they are different. There's no doubt about it in terms of how they like to be approached and how they like to be communicated with. So I found a newsletter actually very helpful. And I originally approached our medical staff services directors, and I said, "Hey, I want to have a way to communicate to medical staff about some programs I'm working on." At the time, I was looking at a value analysis program, but it also applies to robotics and other things. And they said, "Okay." And I said, "Could you give me the emails of every person in medical staff?" Now, I work for a big company. There was at the time there was over 7,000 physicians on staff in 7 states. It was huge, and they just said no. And I said, "Why not? Don't worry. I'll find a way to organize." They're like, "No." I said, "Why not?" And they said, "Well, a few reasons. One, our medical staff don't like us giving out their personal information like that." I said, "Oh, okay. That's a good point. Never thought about that." They said, "And the other thing is you can't keep up with it. They're changing information all the time. We're getting people coming on and people going off. There's no way you're going to be able to keep up with it. And so some of the information you send out is going to be going to, dead-end email boxes." So, I just said, "Oh, okay. All right, that's a good point." She said, "By the way, we get spammed a lot. We get thrown into spam when we send things from." And I said, "Yeah, okay, I didn't know that either. So I that's what I really began to realize that I need to work with them and find how to communicate with physicians. And so what I did is I created a newsletter and said, "Tell you what, if I send you the newsletter and I tell you who the target audience is, can you forward that to them?" And they said, "Yeah." And they said, "But remember, some guys don't open their email." And I said, that's okay, but you know what departments they're on." And I said, "If I tell you who the target audience is, can you make sure that that's presented at medical staff meetings for those departments, or at least made available to them?" I said, "Yeah." And I said, "In some cases, can you post it? Like if it's something that involves the OR?" And they said, "Yeah, we can have somebody do that." And so all of a sudden, they were completely in alignment with the stuff that I wanted to get done in terms of communicating. Now, it's not the only way to communicate with medical staff. Sometimes you just got to get out there and talk to them. And that becomes the responsibility of those who are the lead or co-leads of the Robotics Committee. And if it's a physician, that's the person who needs to do it. So if you have a medical director of your Robotics Committee or your program, that person's the one who needs to get out and be the face of the program to your medical staff. So here's an example. I just threw this together of a robotics program newsletter, and it goes into the Robotics Committee and robotics goals and things like that. And it's important to have something that's short and sweet. anything beyond one page is not going to get read by most people. In fact, they'll never turn it. Most people won't even look past page one. So you got to get it all in there. It's got to be in a form that people can look at very quickly, and they need to see these bolded headlines, because they're going to look at that and say, is that information I want to read? And then have bolded words in each of the subtopic areas that they can skim very quickly. And that way, if somebody just wants to know about Robotics Committee leadership, they can go down and skim that very quickly and say, okay, do I want to read this some more? The other thing I've done is if you have a SharePoint, you could put documents out on the SharePoint and then links through the newsletter so people can click on the links. And then, so if you have something that involves a lot more detail, you can just simply tell them, here's a place to go for more details regarding this particular change or something. And what'll happen is they can click on that and go to it and get that information themselves. And that way you're not, you don't get the sense that everybody's reading this and feel like they have to, pick through it to find out something that's important to them. They can skim through it very quickly. You can skim through this newsletter in about less than a minute and get pretty much everything you need to know about the program. And if you want more detail, then, obviously we'd include links to that as well. So I found this to be very helpful. I found that it's important for people to get information like this because it'll be helpful for communicating with your medical staff. C-suite. My one bit of advice is it's got to be a consistent message. Whatever you send, whatever you communicate to your medical staff, communicate it to the C-suite. Why? Because they talk to each other. And you want them to be on the same page. You don't want one person saying one thing and one person saying another. You will instantly become ostracized if you send inconsistent messages. And so a newsletter is a good way to do it. I always included the C-suite, every member of the C-suite in on the newsletter so that they could see the things that I was talking to that group about. It keeps a consistent message, and one place where everybody can go to see that message. And when you do what I believe is regular communication with your C-suite, whether it's on a quarterly basis, the C-suite has to be communicated to about what's happening with your program. Remember, they invested a lot of money in this, and they want to get some feedback on how it's performing. I would say getting in your C-suite at least once a quarter is recommended. Being able to communicate things like, what's your volumes, what's your utilization, what's your goals, how's your outcomes in terms of quality and things like that. They want to hear that. They want to know that this was a good investment and that people are benefiting from it. And so I think that's the job of the leadership of this committee to make sure that it gets communicated to the C-suite. Nursing and ancillary staff. Typically you're going to have either a perioperative director on your committee or a robotics OR committee if you're fortunate enough, OR coordinator if you're fortunate enough to have a position like that. It's nice to have the people who are literally right in the OR working with the machine on a regular basis. And the reason that's important is because they're going to be able to tell you things that are happening in the operating room that most other people either won't or cannot tell you. So it's good to have that involvement. I also found it important to make sure the chief nursing officer is involved in these discussions. They don't necessarily have to show up at your committee, but if you've got a newsletter, make sure they get a copy of the newsletter. If they decide not to read it, that's entirely up to them. And also when you're communicating your C-suite, your CNO will be there. You want that person to hear what's happening with your program. The chief nursing officer, the great thing about nursing and ancillary staff, your CNO is probably going to have some form of communication pathway that already exists in your organization. So getting to that person and getting them to communicate something out to the nursing and ancillary staff is going to be probably one of the most effective ways of getting communication out. It's really important that you work with the chief nursing officer or their designee. Utilize the process that's already in place. They communicate fairly effectively among their staff. They have to. In order to do that, you just have to capitalize on their communication pathway. You don't have to build a new one. It's already built for you. So just utilize it and make friends with your CNO. They'll become one of your best friends if you let them. Community, I would say coordinate with your marketing and public relations if you aren't already. They're always looking for these stories. They want somebody to be the face of the program. They want to learn little tidbits about the program. They want to know, where the benefits are. They want to know what the type of technology. They're probably going to want pictures of it. They're always looking for an angle on this. The other thing is it's not uncommon they get contacted by the media, and the media want to know something about what's happening in your program. And guess what? They need a spokesperson. And the spokesperson should be somebody from leadership from the robotics program. Now, sometimes I've seen some programs where they will take a surgeon who is very, very busy, who loves to be in front of the camera, and they put them out there. And that's okay. I don't think there's any problem with that. The risk of that, though, is that if that person only talks about their specialty and doesn't talk about the system and the program, your program could suffer from it. Now, it's always good for their practice, and maybe it'll people like seeing that person, particularly if they're pretty effective in front of the media. It could play to your advantage. But you want to be able to at least make sure that they have a little elevator speech, so to speak, planned, so that if they get in front of the cameras, they'll have something to say on the spot. Because you just never know when they're going to show up, and that's usually what happens. Is they get a phone call at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they want to be out there to film by 11 because they're going to have a story at 5, and they want you to be on it. And you're thinking, God, how am I going to prepare for this? Well, I would just say, just have something available at all times, and that way you're always prepared for it. So again, redundant, I know. Questions, contact me at my email or at my website. And thank you for listening to this portion of the program, and please move on to the next portion. Have a great day.